Hello and welcome to another Kellogg conversation. My name is Jim Davies. I'm a computer scientist, but I hang out with environmental scientists, particularly in one specific thing that I will talk to you about in a second, the Sustainability Data Commission. Now, we're going to be talking today about who do we trust in the world of, evidence and accountability in the net zero transition. I'm here with 4 people who have particular expertise in this area. Something about what we're doing at Kellogg and what we're doing at Oxford in this area first. You'll have seen it in those of you who've read The Guardian today. They have a climate crisis header section, and today we find out that the UK is not built for the climate that it will be experiencing in the future. We have many, many more stories that might cause some distress, actually, in some ways. There's even the word crisis should carry some weight here. People are saying, well, it's been going on so long, is it really a crisis? And you can see that when you talk to some of the people who were responsible for first establishing that we needed to get to net zero, that when they first did this, they thought, well, now we've done the science, we just hand it over, and presumably people will say, well, we'll take it from here, thanks for pointing that out. And it's been about 20 years, and it didn't really work that way. And you might draw parallels with stages of grief, starting with denial and anger and depression. I think that's number 4. But actually here it's something more. We actually need to get to action. So who's going to act? Who has agency here? Well, as citizens we have agency. As governments can make decisions about whether they, even in stuff like procurement. Governments spend most of the money in the world, and they decide whether they're going to give this contract to this company or that company. And they can introduce considerations of, well, what is the environmental impact? Is one of these potential suppliers greener than the other? And that can happen at every level of government. It's not just procurement as well, it's relationships. But there's also investment. That when you look at pension funds, private equity, hedge funds, they actually make decisions about investing in companies. And they care. They care about sustainability. Not necessarily the same way as a particular environmental activist in East Oxford might care, but they care. They want to make those decisions in a way that leads to a better future. But how do they know whether to go for this option or that option? How do they know whether to invest in this particular course of action? They need information. And of course, there's an incentive for people to put a positive face on whatever it is that they're doing. Let's not say it's fake news or whatever, but you can choose how you present your activities or your actions in a way that makes you look better. But that can go a little too far as providing the evidence that people need to make the informed choices, whether they're citizens, governments, or investors. One thing that we've been doing at Kellogg is the Sustainability Data Commission, where we're looking at, well, is there a mechanism? Is there a how? How can we provide that evidence? Because, of course, one of the problems with this whole process of denial, anger, depression, acceptance, action, it's iterative. And you can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back if people can find an excuse for doing nothing. And that excuse might start with, well, the science isn't in yet. But once it's been accepted that the science is in, the excuse might be, well, it's just impossible to scale to get the information you would need to make these informed decisions. Now, the Sustainability Data Commission's been looking at that. It's been looking at how can we automatically get that information for certain classes of emissions data from certain companies. And it's going to be tractable. There's the art of the possible. There's stuff that can be done there. But there's so much more that needs to be done in every sector. Now, I meant to bring it with me, though. Perhaps if they do this on YouTube, they can put a little clickable link in that says, and here, you can buy Susan Solomon's book, or borrow it from a library, or borrow it from a friend if they have one. But I was recently recommended a book which I read, which actually took us through the journey for certain other crises, for DDT, for lead in petrol and lead in paint. These things weren't, the science didn't come in one day and then quickly people went through a 7-step program and the earth was off lead and onto something else and everything was sorted. No, it's to and fro for a long, long time. And I think that's where we are at with climate. Of course it's an emergency, of course it's crisis, but you actually need concerted action over a long period of time and actual how. We understand the why, we understand the need, but how are we going to do something? And so with us today we have 4 panellists who will be able to speak to different ways. One of them said earlier, nibbling away at the problem, but that's good enough, you know? If enough of us, I'm not sure about the word nibbling, but you know, it takes, it's not, this is a, as they would say on LinkedIn, it's a journey. So I'm going to turn to our 4 panellists now, who are Freya, Vicky, Jimmy and AJ, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and talk for 5 to 7 minutes, it says, on what are you nibbling away at, for want of a better phrase. So introduce yourself, actually, Freya, but who is a senior sustainability consultant, but let's let everybody give their own job titles.
Thanks very much. So hi everyone, it's an absolute pleasure to be at Kellogg College today talking about data in sustainability. My job, data is almost the most important thing, superseded possibly only by relationships and collaboration, because without that you really get nowhere. You need the will before you have the way. So I work for a company called 3 Keel. We're a relatively young sustainability consultancy. We are owned by Ferra, which is one of the leading sort of science-based agriculture companies in the UK, actually part owned by DEFRA. So we're very much plugged into looking at food systems, crop science, landscapes, which is my particular area. So within 3 Keel, I've done a lot of work on sustainable supply chains, particularly with forest risk commodities, which does involve some carbon. I think talking about data and sustainability, people tend to go for carbon, which is to be front of mind really. It's the kind of the hot topic, and carbon does come into everything, but as well as carbon we look at things like deforestation, biodiversity, even human rights. So as well as looking at kind of farm to fork kind of supply chains and sustainability, I also look at what happens in the fields. So I'm part of a project called Landscape Enterprise Networks, or LENS for short. I personally find it really, really exciting. If you haven't heard about it, I do recommend that you check it out. It's a relatively new initiative, essentially getting funding from companies, organisations with vested interests in the landscape. So a council who might want to mitigate flood risk, for instance, an agri-food business who might want to reduce the carbon footprint of their supply chain, NGOs who are looking to trial innovative new methods to save biodiversity, for instance. So we take those companies and we match them up with landowners, and that's the bit where the data comes in, is we plan what they should be doing in their fields with their land to achieve these targets, so reduce carbon, biodiversity, nutrient management, which is quite a hot one at the moment. And without that data, we just couldn't do it. So I spend a lot of my day-to-day work talking about data, planning data, organising data so that it can be communicated and then operationalised. Have I hit 5 minutes yet?
No.
And I think the problem with data is there's a lot of it out there. There's more data than you could possibly, as a kind of non-sustainability professional, ever hope to get your head around. It's often just very difficult to access and actually very expensive to access. So to take supply chains as an example, one thing that every company that I've worked with in the UK who deals with forest risk commodities, so soy, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, rubber, you name it, they are all trying to assess how sustainable their supply chain is and how deforestation free their supply chain is. but often the information about where their products have come from is just not accessible. I mean, obviously it's there, like someone along the supply chain will know where that soybean has been grown, but getting that data to pass along a chain of actors, both good and bad actors with varying levels of data capabilities, in a credible way is extremely difficult. And governments have waded into this, so the EU's just passed some deforestation regulation that is data regulation, essentially. It sounds like it's a sustainability initiative, but it's really about how data is passed from private companies through to the EU, where it will be centralised. So the biggest barrier to setting up that regulation has really been the computer system, which you might find interesting. And then looking at the complete other end of the spectrum about how we look at what happens on the land, in the landscapes, often the data actually just isn't there. So today I was talking to a company about biochar, which if anyone knows about, it's a way of kind of sequestering carbon and improving nutrient in the soil. And I was saying, do you have the data to show this works? And the answer was no, we don't. We have the theory, but it hasn't been tested yet. Things like understanding how a crop will respond to various implementations, the data's often not there. So sometimes the data's there and you can't get it, and sometimes the data just isn't there, so it's often very frustrating.
No, that's fantastic, and indeed that's what I was going to ask you about in the question. So how much progress have you I mean, it's a bit unfair, but because the problem is that the data doesn't necessarily belong to one organisation, but you need it integrated, put together and analysed in order to decide upon this. Have you got any examples of where actually some progress has been made in that?
Gosh,
I mean,
absolutely, yeah, it's not all a bleak picture. I mean, before I worked in sustainability, I would sort of spend my free time worrying about climate change, and now I get to actually do something about it 9 to 5 and enjoy my personal life, so I can recommend this career path. But yeah, it is actually very positive working with the same companies year on year and really seeing improvements. So just to look at food systems, for instance, I work with quite a few of the supermarkets in the UK. A big project that we run is 3-keel data services. Doesn't sound very glamorous, but it's essentially mapping their supply chains for them. So every single year we reach out to the suppliers of every single supermarket in the UK, which is a huge data exercise, collect that data back in, try and sort the wheat from the chaff, and then report it back to our clients and say, this is where your soy, palm, whatever is coming from, this is how much is deforestation free. And with that data, companies have been able to implement supply chain changes, drop certain suppliers in some cases for not actually adhering to their policies. Because it's all very well having a sustainability policy if you don't have a clue if your suppliers are actually adhering to it. So I did work with one very big company actually who dropped a supplier, blacklisted them for a year because they could see from the data we provided that they weren't compliant. So that was very, very good to see.
Fantastic, that's excellent. Okay, yeah, so actually that's fair warning to the other panellists that we'll be looking for some positive note. No pressure. Vicky.
I'm Vicky Robbins. I work for Oxford City Council. I'm their environmental sustainability manager. And our portfolio is a large and broad church. We cover everything from environmental regulation, so flooding, land pollution and such, but all the way through to retrofit, energy management, energy efficiency, fuel poverty and electric vehicle infrastructure. So it's pretty huge. Data for us is really important because it informs decisions. And it helps us write business cases to get funding. It helps us write grant applications to ensure that we're getting funding from third parties or from the government. And also it's important when we report back to you that when you read stuff that we write, whether it's in reports from our websites or policy documents we influence with government and our local government collaboration that we do, that you can trust it. And so therefore, it's really frustrating where I have a whole heap of data and I want to tell you everything, but obviously I've got to condense it to that website or that bit of social media post and such. And often it prompts many more questions than it does answers. However, I think for us personally, the data structures that we have become more robust as time has gone on. Just like you were saying, initially it's quite innovative, you might be pulling different bits and pieces together and you haven't quite got all the layers, but you try and make some informed assumptions or suppositions around the data you have. And I can tell you a nice positive example of where that's worked really, really well. No doubt you've read the newspapers and you'll be aware that in Oxford, energy capacity is a premium, and we've got areas where we are right at the top of the capacity we have. And that's going to impact things like growth and bringing new people and houses and such like into the city. Well, what we've been doing is been working across all the different councils, including the county council, and we've created all the layers of data, working with our electricity suppliers, National Grid, working on the types of houses that we have, the tenure, the usage, working with our big businesses like BMW and Unipart, and we're looking at what energy they have, and mapping it all into a single system so that we can plot as these new developments come on board, or as we get some new generation that goes on in a certain part of the county, we can plot the ebb and the flow and predict what we need 2030, 2050, 2060. That's fantastic and it's great, and it starts to give us a model that is important because it's layered, but also we can agree on it because we all know the data inputs that come into it. That's the good bit. The hard bit is now putting that into action. So, you know, National Grid needs to go and build that new pylon in order to put the reinforcement in for the wires to go in to allow that bit of progression to happen. But without that data, and without data that you can trust, you can't make those big macro decisions that have a rather big price tag attached to them, so that you can go with confidence back to government, if you're National Grid or us or whomever, and say, right, this is what the modelling shows and we can prove it, and here's the evidence underneath. How are we going to make this happen? So my work can be really, really fulfilling, but also very frustrating.
One quick question.
Yeah.
In terms of, so you're doing this, you're putting that effort into, presumably some of that same requirement stroke opportunity exists for other councils.
Yeah, so across the county, we have a collaboration. So we have this sort of spatial view, if you like, of the county. And if you can imagine, this has been replicated all across England. I can't talk about Wales and Scotland, I'm sorry, because I'm not sure, but across England for sure. And each of these, if you imagine, they are nested layers that go all the way up into regions. So we're in the economic heartlands, and then it goes all the way up to a national level. So that when they're talking at the National Grid level, they can then see the different stratas all the way down to what's technically, if you like, is a primary substation, which has all those cables that lead to your houses. They all go into a primary substation, so it can go all the way to that level. So we're getting the data, we've got the methodologies there, so it has actually extrapolated out. It's going to be really, really beneficial.
And if you're, because presumably some of the data has more than one use, and might be used by more than one council, does it get effectively shared? I mean, how does that? Well,
we have data sharing agreements, which are really important, but we also have public access. So like all your census data, for example, so we can work out about population shifts or areas of deprivation or areas of high density housing. So for example, 46% of houses in Oxford don't have access to off-street parking. For me, in working with electric vehicle infrastructure, that's a really key thing for me to know, because those people can't just plonk in a charger as things stand and charge their cars. So how do we make sure that those people don't get left behind in the transition from petrol and diesel cars over to electric vehicle? So, yeah, you can see how it works.
Thank you. Jimmy.
Yes. Hi, I'm Jimmy. I wear a couple of different hats at the university as a research associate at Oxford Net Zero, but also the lead for business school and Smith School collaborations and initiatives, where we're looking at creating new research initiatives around sustainable business. And my own research is at that intersection between the two, which is carbon accounting, which basically takes the convolutedness of financial accounting and matches it with the complexity of greenhouse gas methodologies to create something that's both complex and convoluted. And so for the next 5 minutes, I'll try to weave a narrow thread through those two in a way that is hopefully appreciated and simplified. But I want to talk about basically 2 points, I think, when it comes to data, and build on what has been said in terms of data structure. I want to look at data as a structure, and I want to then look at the passage of time. And these two are actually quite important and interconnected when we start looking at how the accounting system works. First off, with data, frequently when we think of data, we think of the metrology of data, the measurement, the number, the value. But yet, if I just gave you a number like 10 kilos, what does that mean? Is 10 kilos the amount of hay that a cow eats in a morning? Or is 10 kilos what you're trying to lose at the gym because you're trying to get fit and fit into thinner clothes? So if we don't have the right context for what a number means, it's impossible to make a decision around. So then what gives context? Well, what gives context to numbers is actually the category systems and the creations of what does that number mean. So 10 kilos of hay is very different than 10 kilos of weight loss. And it's the same thing when we start thinking about how accounting systems are created. We have assets, liabilities, revenue, income, this and that, and it is very well defined what those categories mean, what they represent. They've been around for about 600 years. The balance sheet itself has been around since 1930, and so we have very long history of understanding the trust broadly amongst large groups of people, what those categories mean and what those numbers represent, and therefore what decisions should be made. Greenhouse gas accounting evolved since the 1970s. And the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what we use for corporate accounting, came out of the 2004, started in 2004 up to today. If you ask someone what do those categories mean, scope 1, scope 2, and the 15 categories of scope 3, people can tell you the headlines of what the categories are. But when you really dive into what's underneath it and what is represented by it, you'll probably get 100 different answers. And that's because the protocol themselves, in terms of how that data is structured, allows you about 100 different methodologies and contexts of what goes into that, underneath that umbrella. And so fundamentally, when we start looking at how these carbon accounting data structure works, is the structure does not impart trust because the structure is not as rigorously defined and boxed in of what that number means, right? And so when we start looking at some of these issues with how greenhouse gas accounting is being used to make financial decisions, which is now spanning the two disciplines, we start to see a lot of things that just go haywire. So when you start looking at, people have done studies of what is the range of greenhouse gas accounting numbers of a single company that can come out, and that range can be anywhere from 100 to 250% difference by following the greenhouse gas protocol. So everyone's following the same protocol, but they're coming up with answers that differ by 150 to 250%. So how much trust do you have in being able to make a data-driven decision when that number itself is not stable? Okay, so the reason for the reason why the categories are so important is it gives you trust of what that number represents. And the second thing is it has to represent time. And the reason why we have to think about how accounting systems represent time is because that's what the financial accounting system does, and that's how decision-making is done. Decision-making is about taking historical data, which has lagging indicators, and connecting it to future potential data, which is about the future indicators. And we're always using historical data to be able to affect what that future looks like. When we look at financial accounting, it is structured to account for the passage of time. And that's one of those subtleties that are hidden underneath the data structure of how it's just simply presented. The balance sheet is where we put our historical data, historical activities, because it's things that has occurred. This building was built 15 years ago, so it sits on Kellogg's College's balance sheet. But the operational costs of the electricity and the natural gas and the staff goes into the profit and loss statement, which is the current, where you put all the current information. And then anything that has to do with the future of projections of where the college is going, that goes into your pro formas, into your forward curves, into financial modeling, and you keep that financial model separate from the historical data of the value of the asset. Right. So in financial accounting, there are very, very clear rules of how we treat time. Let's contrast that with how greenhouse gas accounting works, which is based on life cycle assessment methodologies. And life cycle assessment, if you're familiar with that, is a cradle to grave summation into a single number. So when I tell you that the carbon footprint of your car is 10 tons of carbon, that means all of the manufacturing, the lifetime of the driving of it for 10 years, and then its disposal. But if we think of the temporality of those three elements, that's past, present, and future, added together into a single number. So when I say 10 tons of carbon for your car, do you know what component went into the manufacture? What the assumption was for how long you're going to drive it for and how frequently you drive it for? Or is it just a national average of what an average car looks like, not taking into account that you live in city center Oxford and you mostly take the bus and you just drive on the weekend, or some other context like that, right? And so what a lot of my research has looked at is, okay, well, if these two data structures are so different, one data structure clearly focused on time, that differentiates time, and the other data structure sums all of time, what can you do to solve that problem? Well, you need to create a data structure that represents time within greenhouse gas accounting. And so to me, and I think I'll leave that as my contribution, is that we have to think of not just data, but we also think about how that data is structured. And where I work on is that structure is temporal.
So, thank you. I think that there's two messages out of that. One, it's complicated, which I think we figured, but I mean, you get this sort of, it becomes not being able to deal with this complexity rather than complication, perhaps, is one of these reasons why people say, well, if electric cars are no good, because think about the batteries, it's like, well, okay, that's fine. So, in terms of a positive note, what you're saying is we need to work out what the accounting basis is, what a sensible accounting basis is, so that we can take this data that's available to us, organize it in such a way that it supports these decisions. Yep. And yeah, it's been 22 years since 2004. Does it look like we're making good progress in that area? Is there a consensus emerging?
Well, I hope so. It's what I do. No, but in all seriousness, though, I think, Vicky, what you talked about with the planning, the electric transmission planning and putting it together, that's a great case study of how that historical data and forward data are connected together. And it's a very tightly bounded case study of electrical infrastructure for Oxfordshire or Oxford, right, itself. But when we start looking at corporate accounting, now we're talking thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of companies globally operating in very different environments. There needs to be something that coordinates and allows us to understand the context across all of them. And so that has been lacking. I think what has been working is people have been really focused on the metrology bit. How do we get the number accurate? How do we get a methodology to be accurate? But the methodology itself allows you about 100 different options. So it can't get accurate if you don't draw the same boundary and have everyone adhere to the same boundary, right? And that's the part that has been lacking so far. There's people that are starting to understand that boundaries are the issues. They've looked at the spatial boundary of what is a company, but they've yet to look at the temporal boundary of how long do these things last for. And so that's really what I'm working on, is what's that temporal boundary and how do we represent the passage of time?
Very philosophical, potentially, but also incredibly important. AJ.
So I have the least expertise on this panel. I'm a journalist. So I'm going to kind of talk about how people receive a lot of this data. I wanted this to be useful, so I actually did some data analysis internally. So Nature, which is where I work as a journalist with Springer Nature. I am in the journalism division, so if any of you have papers to publish, do not come to me. I have nothing to do with it. So we have about 600,000 subscribers for like a newsletter, which goes out every week. It's called Nature Briefing, which gives a snapshot of the journalistic content. Please do sign up if you haven't already. And we do regular surveys of this 600,000 people to understand what they want to read about, so that we can produce more of that. One of the top issues that a lot of people care about, at least this 600,000 people, is climate change. And we also track what people read. And when we go to our website and look at readership numbers, climate change it's usually at the bottom. So everybody wants to know a lot more about climate change, but nobody is reading stuff about it. And I think one of the problems is related to trust in data, and a lot of our coverage, being a science publication, is about international treaties. It's about new database reports. Those are the kind of stories we do. And I think this is deeply linked to trust. Like, a lot of people don't trust a lot of these data sources. And I can give a very particular example. I looked at, before I came here, I looked at about 1,400 ESG index funds and looked at who is represented in those funds. The dominant share of it, of most of them actually, is Mag 7, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Meta. Environmentally sustainable. I mean, they are compared to a thermal power plant. But you are investing in these funds assuming you're going to stay invested, let's say, for 20 years. So do you think in the next 20 years, the best use of your environmentally conscious money is best spent on Meta? What do you think? And I think that offers a clear example of, like, there's so much uncertainty, like what Jimmy was talking about, right? There's so much uncertainty in a lot of these data streams. And one thing I would add to his point about temporal difficulties is who collected the data. I think an ordinary person looking at data doesn't really know the motivations of the actors who collected and analyzed the data. And we have very little understanding, I think, as members of the public, as to the veracity of each sources of data that we look at. And I will leave you with like a positive thing, because you insisted that I give you something to be hopeful about. Just last month, there was a conference which has been called the Alternative COP, which happened in Colombia. I don't know how many of you have been following this, but I had a colleague at Nature who went for it, and this is basically coming off from the COP in Brazil, where they could not make any progress. It's based on a consensus mechanism, and the same countries block it all the time. So about 60 countries got together in Colombia, and they said, let's act. We have a lot of evidence. Let's see what we can get together and agree on in terms of action. And one of the things that I'm quite hopeful about is there is some early conversation about subsidies for fossil fuels. The most recent data from OECD is OECD economies. They spent about $920 billion on subsidies to fossil fuels in 2024. That's the latest data. That's a number that you can track, and that's a number that you can compel many governments to release. And this number has actually gone up in the last few years because of the war in Ukraine. There is a lot more public subsidy for fossil fuels to keep prices low for people. I think like there has to be a greater sense of like these are 2 or 3 big numbers or data sources that the public can track, and it will be put out by an independent entity which is trusted, and it has to be a limited number, and that you can track over time. I think if we can't do that, then we're just going to be drowning in data, and most people won't trust it, and we're just going to kind of keep debating this issue of which data is good, which is not good. It won't translate into a political or a policy platform that people can track. If it's too much, you just get drowned out in too many choices. What do I look at? I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I think that's nice having the alternative COP as a positive. That's great. But also you've opened up another couple of things, really, because context is everything to understanding data, but context is also infinite. And how are you going to go and get all of that? Of course, one thing now, I'm sure some of you will have seen these stories, but occasionally there are the funders, the owners, perhaps, of these big AI initiatives, holding up the promise that, yes, of course, the data centers will be using a lot of energy, but AI is going to solve all the problems in the world, and it'll solve the climate crisis for you. It'll key account, so it'll do everything. But here it's about data. Let's ask AJ first, because I believe you spend a lot of time thinking about AI and big data. How can, outside their ESGs and so on, is there hope that Microsoft and Anthropic and OpenAI can help us with this? I mean, they're all about data, aren't they?
One thing I would say, I've been tracking Google in particular for a while, is the amount of self-reporting that's here, which it's meaningless in my opinion. There is no point in Google disclosing data on its data center use. It has to be somebody outside. I'll start there. That's what I mean by data quality. Who's reporting it? What are their motivations? So I mean, and also the point about AI is there is so much uncertainty, and they are writing off a lot of it to other entities, right? Like these data centers are not owned by Google, and it helps them financially as well. When Jimmy is talking about like financial accounting in this current year, it helps them to keep it off their books and put it in some other entity. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is I understand the level of public distrust. Because this data that Google is reporting on its carbon footprint is meaningless. It says nothing to me. So then what is useful is something we can have a conversation about that, but that has to start with, it shouldn't be self-reported. It should be some independent agency that looks at this and that compels them to report something that is meaningful. I'll start there and then we track it over time. So I'm not going to say anything about the predictions that AI companies have that we will solve cancer. I mean, that who can even say, right? Like, maybe they're right, maybe they're not right. I don't think they're right, but it's just my opinion. Yeah, so I think we need something that can be tracked over time, and then we can take public decisions which are relevant and informed by data, if it is valuable data, and if it actually informs you of something that is actually happening. So it can't be done by Google.
Right. This is making me think again about, because one thing about accounting, I drawing on personal experience, you shouldn't extrapolate from it, but I have a father-in-law who's trained in accountancy. And one thing he said is, you know, give me a while, I can show you that every part of your organisation is loss-making. Even if, overall, you seem to be still in business. Now, obviously, we've all heard the phrase accounting tricks and so on. Typically, companies, you know, obviously there's a degree of, they would like to protect the data, because this data and the metadata and the context actually is how they do business. Some of that will be competitive advantage. They won't want to share everything. So they presumably work with accountants to provide a report. And it's not quite self-reporting, but it's... So what's the role of accountants in fixing this?
Oh, wow, role of accounting. Oh, talking about getting philosophical here. Starting back 1929, when financial accounting got... No, to be serious, so a little bit about the role of accounting is actually quite interesting. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, the role of an accountant was relatively different than the role of accountant today. And so the role back then, when we were just starting to industrialize and all these companies were just new, how do you report profit and loss, and how does an investor know, right? And so these ideas of balance sheets and income statements were just becoming formed in the 1800s all the way through to the early 1900s. And it was stated by the accountants back then, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that the accountant's role is to use their judgment to decide what's the best way to represent a company. Okay, which is basically a very fancy way of saying we do creative accounting. We invent what a company should look like. If you want to get really philosophical, this entire branch of accounting that says accountings invent reality, because unless you put a number to it, it doesn't exist. Right? Unless you put it into a category, it doesn't exist. I digress. But a lot of financial accountants back in those days said that they had and they were proud of the fact that they had the creativity to be able to decide how best to represent a company. And that's important because if you're a railroad manufacturer, which is hugely capital intensive, how are you going to represent that using numbers relative to, let's say, a law firm or a professional services engineering firm? How would you use numbers to represent that company? And would you use the same methodology to represent those two said companies? One of the contributing factors to the 1929 stock market crash was that there was no standard in accounting, and that companies could invent their way of presenting their income, their revenue, their expenses, their profitability. And so it wasn't until 1930 that was formed the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, of which one of their mandates was to standardize financial accounting. And so to get to your question of then what's that role of an accountant, today that role of an accountant is to report to those rules and regulations, which has standardized the definitions of balance sheets, of income statements, of cash flow, of equity, of this, of that. All of those have now been standardized. And the role of the accountant is to interpret how does a company fit into those categories, rather than to invent categories for themselves that is most useful for their own company.
So we need these standards to, I mean, not to keep accountants honest, of course accountants are honest, but, you know, just to have them, it can be well, even then, the self-reported, presumably we need some sort of digital signatures on this or whatever. It doesn't get too technical, but you actually need to be able to trust the lineage, the provenance of the data you're producing. Is it different in the public sector? Because there can be more, there's supposed to be more accountability, one hopes.
Absolutely. I mean, we have different levels of sign-off in terms of the financial accountability, if you like. So I can sign off to a certain degree with my team, but if it goes above that, it has to go somewhere else. In our procurement, where our procurement is really, really complex, and it has to be open, has to be transparent, and also even the way we evaluate tenders that come in, we have to have at least 3 people, and you have to have one person that knows nothing about the subject at all to keep it really, really clear. Now, those structures are really, really good for transparency and accountability. But if you think about it, especially if I'm working with an area, or we're working in an area of innovation where we need to talk to these companies or find out about technology, those sorts of structures can not get in the way, that's the wrong way, but can, if you like, dictate how you can communicate with these companies. So things have got better as we can work with grants and do pilots and sort of test beds for different things, but it becomes quite niche. So scalability, if you like, you have this bit before you can move to that bit. So the accountability there, it's still there, but I think it's evolving, or has to evolve as technology moves on to enable us to deliver quicker and faster. But our accountability is to our public. That's they're our accountants.
You're okay, but there are boundaries when you start running into the fact that you can be transparent about what you're doing, but of course, if a company's doing something, that's their business, and actually the nature of the procurement process, mind you can't compromise that. You've got other issues. So boundaries. As a consultant, can you work across these boundaries? Can we see the whole of the landscape? Can we see the system problem? What do we do to make these solutions scalable?
Well, I feel like I should confess actually and say that I have trained as an accountant.
It's the zeitgeist.
Before I was a sustainability consultant, I was a financial consultant for 2 years, so did a lot of accounting. And I still do a lot of accounting, carbon accounting, other kinds of sustainability accounting. I think the boundaries point is a very good one. I think that I've got a lot of different thoughts. I think self-reporting is so common when it comes to sustainability data. I mean, particularly, I think carbon's quite mature in this respect, in that it has become slightly more automated, and people know what they're looking for there. But where I work, which is much more in the food system space, so yeah, things like deforestation, conversion free as a metric that we'll measure. There are no standards there really, so and there are no kind of external independent bodies, like there's no greenhouse gas protocol, for instance, for tracking your supply chain and disclosing the percentage or the number of hectares of forests that have been cut down as part of your procurement. So self-reporting is really the only way to do it. And I I think that companies make mistakes. Do I think that there's widespread misleading going on? Not really, having seen behind the scenes. I mean, obviously, by the time a company is working with a sustainability consultant, they've made a decision to do the right thing and paid a lot of money to kind of have an external body come in and work with them. So they're open to kind of getting any skeletons out of the closet, or, you know. But we don't just work with our clients, we obviously work with their supply chains. So we'll be working with first tier, second tier, third tier importers, lots of different, you know, bodies that interact in the chain of procurement. Have I ever seen kind of just lies being kind of touted? Not really. I think when it comes to the corporate space, being able to make sustainability claims that are seen as robust and publicly reportable is a valuable asset. So you say if I was a supplier of, I don't know, eggs or something like that, and I'm selling to a supermarket that has a policy, a public commitment to source 100% deforestation free. That's their commitment. If I can't tell my customer, yeah, all the animal feed that I fed to my chickens to produce my eggs was deforestation free, they'll probably drop me from the supply chain, because there's always competition. If you can't do it, if you can't provide the data, obviously within reason, and that's where kind of boundaries come into things, because as I said earlier, some data just isn't there. If you can't do it, then I think you'll be making a financial loss. So on the financial point, actually, I think there's good reason for companies to self-report accurately. However, a lot of these data points are being put forward to support public-facing claims, and obviously the public need to have trust in these claims. If a company says, you know, yes, we've hit our target, people want to say, okay, where have you got that from then? And that's where the role of assurance comes in. And I think we haven't really talked about assurance in the sustainability space. So obviously if you publish your annual report, your financial reports as a company for the year, you'd expect that to kind of go on Companies House and be checked and so on. And the same thing is starting to happen in the sustainability space, particularly in carbon, much more mature, but even when it comes to food systems, a number of clients that I've worked with will set out a methodology for their traceability and deforestation reporting, just to keep using that example. That'll be made publicly available, and they'll bring in an external consultant, so maybe like a KPMG or an EY or so on, to make sure that they've actually followed those steps, and they can then give it the tick of assurance. And that's becoming increasingly common. So I think the kind of credibility of the data doesn't worry me too much. I think what worries me more is the just huge gaps in actually getting the data, because companies can only report what they have and what they can afford to have. I mean, in an ideal world, a company would have millions of pounds to spend on, you know, you can trace things for your supply chain if you have enough money to do so. You can pay for segregated supply chains. You can pay for blockchain technology, you can pay for a certification scheme, you can pay for organic. So you can, if you kind of have the resources to do it, kind of overcome a lot of these data barriers. But we are living in a climate where companies are, sorry, excuse the pun, are putting fewer resources, both financially and kind of FTE, towards their sustainability departments. I mean, the cost of living crisis, what's happening in Iran as well, things are becoming more expensive, and I think I do slightly worry that sustainability is seen as a kind of a nice to have and a bit of edge in the market. So if you can say, yeah, my products are sustainable, or, you know, this is a net zero product, if you can say that, that's kind of seen as a great marketing thing. But if you have to make cuts, that might be the first thing to go, in which case, where we get left with data, it stops being collected because it's no longer serving a commercial purpose.
So really, we've managed to reduce the climate crisis to an accounting problem.
Yeah.
But it's a big accounting problem. It's a really big accounting problem, one for which we don't necessarily have all of the methodology, the standards, the frameworks. We don't necessarily have the data. I think it's really interesting what Freya said, because it comes back to actually either Greta Thunberg saying, well, you know, do recycle your plastics, but it's not going to make any difference what you do on a domestic level. She didn't quite say that, but paraphrasing, just saying, actually looking to the consumer, there's another very interesting speaker, commentator, author in this area, Doctoral, who's saying, you can't shop your way out of a monopoly. And when we have this increasing consolidation of suppliers and multinationals, actually consumer choice not so much. Governments, on the other hand, and I'm not promoting Oxford to being, governing the entire country, and you did exclude Scotland and Wales, but actually there, it's about nibbling, chipping. It's about these gradual, progress in different areas, establishing ways, principles for how can we account for this. Can we do better than trying to account for it all in financial year? What do we do about the supply chains? And there you've got a collective action problem, of course, because it would be great if everybody in your supply chain had the same standards for accounting, had the same degree of transparency, then stuff could work together. And actually, to answer my own question that I gave for AJ, actually there is some hope. So, it's actually looking for how can we use some of the new technologies to either acquire data, acquire sensible proxies for that observation you're looking for, simply, leveraging what otherwise is simply a net contributor to the problem in terms of data centers and AI. So I think there's a lot of positivity there. Thank you very, very much for that. But, a sense that actually this I don't want to say it's the age of accountants, but we are looking for that systematic approach to how we account for what we do and how to pun on it, how we can have that accountability and how we can actually set out on this journey and looking for the opportunities. Because one thing that Freya said there, that actually, sometimes it might be useful for a company to know what it's doing accurately and be able to trust that data. When you can find those lines of advantage, another mini plug for Susan Solomon's book, there's a phrase in there. She talks about a breakthrough when actually some of the stakeholders found a convenient truth to get behind. And let's hope that we can do that. Now, that was the break that I was asked to give. It was very short. It was merely me breathing. But I think we've got time for some questions from the audience, and we have a microphone. Look, that hand's already up. And another one, but I'm going to give just a reward for preempting the whole thing.
Yes.
Now, we've got more people than we had in the room earlier, so have we got a microphone for you? We have. Excellent.
So, what is the distinction that people make? Like, how could one differentiate between greenwashing and active climate action? How could we differentiate it?
Okay. So, who? I'm tempted to throw this one at you, Jimmy, but that's a bit unfair. No, actually, you take it.
I can
yeah,
take it. That's a really good question. How do you tell the difference between active harm and passive, so to speak, right? And this is just my opinion, is I don't think you can. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we can't tell the difference. One of the great things about accounting, I guess, as the further I get into it, the more I think it's absolutely amazing, is that one of the principles of it is being able to tell apart what is different without sacrificing what is similar. Or you can tell it the other way around. You're trying to understand what is similar between two items without sacrificing and making more similar the things that you want to keep different. So in essence, you're trying to, when you're using numbers to describe things and companies and objects, your goal is to understand what is similar and what is different. So I like to say that an accountant can tell you the difference between apples and oranges because you have one apple, one orange, and two fruit, right? But they very clearly delineate and maintain similarities and differences. And so when we look at two objects, one which is greenwashing and one which is actively harming the environment, and if you can't tell the difference, there's a problem with the accounting system, right? You have to be able to understand what is similar and what is different. And I would argue that is one of the weaknesses of the system that we have today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's go for the third row, gentleman who leapt in very quickly.
Yeah, thanks. That's great discussion of good things. I was going to challenge slightly this idea that we can reduce it to accounting. Partly, I guess, picking up on that last point, the other important part of this is, of course, the people and how they behave. And there's a lot of discussion saying that, you know, behaviour change is a problem. I think one of the things that might be contributing to lack of trust is attempts to put people into categories, which can be quite offensive, perhaps. And I think nobody's suggesting that, but it's dealing with this behaviour change, dealing with people who are not in categories, which is a massive challenge.
So, how do you feel about responding to that, Freya?
Well, can I ask just a question back at...
Yeah, no, you can, of course.
What kind of categories do you mean for people?
An example.
Yeah,
I think I know what you mean, but let's not put words in your mouth.
yeah. That's what I was checking.
Yeah. Well, so let's say I'm leading a project that's trying to look at whether the university research computing can become sustainable. And one of my premises there is that we are a group of people with agency to make decisions, and that we could actually perhaps lead by example as well as by telling other people to do. And one of the things I've come across is that there are people who respond more to example and less to detailed information, and other people who respond more to information, and understanding those differences can be useful.
See, in that case, I think I might pass your question to Vicky, because I think probably behaviour change is something that councils have to come up against more than I do in the corporate world.
Addressing
Yeah.
particular categories and actually thinking about audience. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
do you have it?
Well, I think going back to what you talked about convenient truth.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, you know, trying to promote any type of behaviour change, it needs to be a benefit in there for the person. You know, we all like to be altruist, and going back to your point earlier, you know, we say we want to learn about the climate, we don't necessarily read about it. You know, you know, if it's easy to recycle, you will. You know, if it's economically better for you to drive an electric vehicle than a non-electric vehicle, then you will. If it's, you know, easy for you to install a heat pump into your house without having to turn it upside down, then you will. So I think the behaviour change comes when things are more convenient, or that motivational factor, whether it be economic, whether it be your lifestyle, whether it be what your friends think, whatever the case may be, whatever that motivator is that's when that behaviour change happens. And I think our role as a council is to give you information you can trust to try and make those informed decisions. And believe me, that's not always easy. But if you can go to a place where you can go, okay, I actually want to take action, and I can find this information that allows me to do so in a language that makes me go, okay, I can take some agency with this, then you're more likely to take the action. And going back to what you were talking about, the recycling, yeah, it may not change the world, but if everybody does it, it makes it a bit better. And you know, for the council, we've just combined all of our recycling in the city to make it a bit easier for people, so hopefully more recycling will happen. And going back to just giving you a bit of good news, we're one of the top recyclers in the country, so you can pat yourself on the back on that one.
Fantastic, thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you so much for this excellent discussion. Actually, I have to confess I'm about to leave a bit more confused than I came in with. Because on the one hand, the two accountants here, they're pitting themselves against each other at the same time. I want to ask Jimmy actually. So you've mentioned this thing about we are the most sustainable college at Oxford, Kellogg. We pride ourselves with that. And as Freya was also saying, a lot of companies, a lot of everyone that I sort of get exposed to has bought into the desire of being sustainable and sort of signal that. And Jimmy seems to be puncturing all of this by saying that actually the system itself is sort of flawed. I was wondering if you could give us a sort of concrete example, maybe of this building itself. This is a passive house building. This is we advertise this. What's wrong with
What's wrong with this building?
Specifically to say that because you spent a lot of time talking about accounting systems, but then showcasing that the sustainability side of it has to be because you're proposing a new system.
Yeah.
What is it about time, and what are you trying to say there?
Yeah, let me give you an example. It's not about this building specifically, but using this building as an example to then go into the larger problem, is that yes, this building was built as a passive house. What that means is the ongoing operations of this facility is net zero. So there's enough insulation to reduce the thermal load, so that way you sip electricity rather than consume electricity, and then you can offset that electricity in various interesting ways. And so, yeah, this building is net zero. Nothing wrong with that. Where we start getting into uncertainty, right? And when I say, okay, greenhouse gas protocol gives you that range of answers of 100 to 250%. To me, if we think of that from a financial language, that's the range of uncertainty of my number of 10 as plus or minus 150%. So how do I make a decision based on that? If I add to this building the embodied carbon that went into the manufacture of the wood, the glass, the steel, I would start using something, an industry-specific emissions factor, to be able to calculate the carbon that is within this. What's the uncertainty of those emissions factors? Where does the emissions factor for the steel come from? Well, generally speaking, one option is to use what's called the EcoInvent database. There's 3 major databases around the world that you would use. The EcoInvent database is all of that data was generated by the Swiss government. So all of the examples of those emissions factors are from Switzerland. Is that specific case studies of those emissions factors 100% applicable to Kellogg College? They might be, they might not. What's the uncertainty that those two are matched up? And does that uncertainty then help you tell the similarities and differences? So generally speaking, these emissions factors, then we can build that up. Are all passive houses equally passive? Well, you can do studies, you can do surveys, and generally surveys of construction within like hundreds of buildings in LA, hundreds of buildings in Sydney. When you start looking at these, they can give you a very nice distribution of what's the embodied carbon of the building stock, right? And those distributions of carbon inside building stocks have a standard deviation of 30%. So, okay, if I now take standard deviation of 30% and I apply it to any given structure, unless I'm using specific data to that specific building, I'm now adding a lot of uncertainty into the calculation for understanding what is it that we're doing. So to me, the issue, and the reason why I am challenging the existing carbon accounting systems, is it embeds a lot of uncertainty in there that a user probably doesn't even know is there. But when you open the hood and you start playing with the numbers and looking at where do the numbers come from, and what are the distributions of the numbers, and where are the assumptions within the numbers, you start realizing that, I mean, if you're a Malaysian company, you have 2 options of emissions factors. One's the US EPA and one's DESNIS. Which one's more applicable if you're trying to install something in Malaysia? Right. That's what I mean by where these uncertainties creep into the system, and why we need to really start understanding what these boundaries are and what are the assumptions going into these numbers that we're generating.
So basically, there's a lot of work to do. Really.
Can I quickly respond to that? Or
Yeah. No. Well, okay. Well, this
30
would be,
seconds. I was doing a carbon and a footprint this morning, actually. It was on the EcoInvent database, actually.
There we go.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
But I think from a sort of consultant perspective, we're all about operationalising data.
Mhm.
And I never have lost sleep over a carbon footprint not being right. Because they're never right. They're all a house of cards, really, of assumption upon assumption. And what matters is firstly that everyone's using the same process to make their assumptions, because then they become comparable, and it's not the data points themselves that matter, like you said, like what is 10 kilos. It's the comparison between, if 10 companies have all reported using the same methodology, they need to do it the same way. The numbers themselves don't matter too much, it's their relationships, and then that drives the kind of commercial competition, or you know, illegal competition even to hit certain targets, net zero, for instance. I also think that the questions you're asking data really matter. So if the data you've used, the assumptions you've used are just good enough to get you the answer, like if you're saying, how can I change my supply chain to lower my emissions by at least 50%, doesn't matter if you're a little bit out, because it's telling you what you should do, and it's going to therefore, on the positive note, do something positive. If you
I think that's lovely, because the point is, it's not, we don't have to be too, we don't have to make an absolutely numerically, mathematically perfect world. It just needs to be good enough to save the planet.
Yeah.
You know, that'll do. So, Anna, as for this building, well, I don't know exactly whether the numbers are right or not, but it's better than doing it a different way. So if this was the best action at the time, and we had enough information to make that choice at least, we know we might need more information for future choices, but at least it gives us a way forward. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm noticing we did start slightly late, which is my excuse for why it's 6:30. We have one more thing to do, otherwise I'll be in trouble. Wednesday, the 3rd of June, there is another Futures in Common Nature, Trust and Community, the Hub, Kellogg College, on community and cooperation from micro movements to major impacts. So I commend that. But for today, there are drinks, opportunities to converse. Have at them, I say. Thank you very much. And thank you for